The simmering war of words between the United States and North Korea reached new heights last week, arguably when Pyongyang said hostilities could break out at any time. The former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton says threats against the North are dangerous and short-sighted and don't help resolve the row. So what should Washington do? Ambassador Robert Gallucci led U.S. talks with North Korea during the last nuclear crisis in 1994. Now, welcome, Ambassador. Are there any parallels between your discussions then with, it was Kim Il-sung there, the ever-present, or should I say, the eternal leader of the country, at a time when they didn't actually have nuclear weapons. They were suspected of enriching uranium and perhaps having plutonium. So what are the lessons, though, that you can draw?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that there certainly are parallels. In 1993 and 94, we were concerned about an active North Korean program to develop nuclear weapons. They didn't have nuclear weapons, or we didn't think they had nuclear weapons. And we decided to enter negotiations with the North Koreans in consultation with the South Koreans, but aimed at stopping that North Korean weapons program. In retrospect, it seems like it was a good idea. We ended up with a halt to the North Korean production of plutonium for nuclear weapons that lasted a decade. Ultimately, the deal fell apart. The North Koreans began testing nuclear weapons, developing ballistic missiles, and fast forward to where we are today. And if there's a lesson, it is that negotiations can work. They aren't necessarily permanent. One may need to go back and continue those negotiations. But I would say that there is a negotiating track sometimes with North Korea, and there may be one now.
The point would be you have to know what the leadership there actually wants. What does Kim Jong-un actually want, and what can you offer him in negotiations? That's going to be the key.
Actually, I'd have it a little different than the way you just put it. I think it would be nice to know, as you said, what exactly they want and what they want that we could give them. But you really don't find that out if we're judging by our past experience with negotiations. You don't find that out until you enter negotiations. You could and should guess and try to prepare for those negotiations, but until you sit down with the North and they say what they're looking for, and we think right now, for example, we know what they're looking for. We may be wrong, but we really won't know until we actually engage them in negotiations.
Is it in any way helpful to say things such as what Donald Trump said, saying only one thing will work, and everybody took that as being, well, the warfare option?
Yeah, look, President Trump's comments, whether they're at the UN or messages to Rex Tillerson and Secretary of State, you can take at face value. And I think some people are pleased to have someone yell back at North Korean leadership, in this case Kim Jong-un. But taking a step back from the whole situation, which I think we all recognize, and we're having this conversation, this could deteriorate to some sort of military confrontation and ultimately to the Second Korean War. As soon as you say that, then one becomes a little less enthusiastic about language which raises tension rather than lowers it. I, for one, don't think this is the right context for a game of chicken. I much prefer a more cautious, deliberate approach to the North Koreans. But, of course, President Trump is President Trump.
Yeah, Ambassador, I mean, I think that sort of policy misstep or rhetoric misstep on either side is what markets have been really concerned about. But what about China? Because yesterday, in the opening of the 19th Party Congress here in Beijing, we had that congratulatory note coming through from Pyongyang. And our guest at the time had said, you know, it's like getting that birthday card from the ex-wife that you don't really want to hear from. So, you know, Beijing has this perceived influence over Pyongyang, but does China really have that leverage? What can they do?
I don't think it's right to call it perceived influence. There's one country really that does, on an ongoing way, have leverage, and that is China. But it's not a free pass for Beijing. There are outcomes they wish to avoid. They wish to avoid anything that would bring American military and naval assets up to Northeast Asia and their doorstep. They're not interested in putting so much pressure on North Korea that the regime collapses. So this is not something which is unrestrained in terms of what the Chinese can do. But they do have leverage, and the North Koreans clearly rely still, even in this sanctions regime that we have now, still rely on the Chinese. So it's not unreasonable for Seoul and Washington to look to Beijing to help out here and try to bring North Korea to a more reasonable position and hopefully the negotiating table.
Is the way that Washington, or I should say, is the way that President Trump going about this the most effective way, fairly abrasive, bringing in trade threats and tensions as part of, this whole thing? Do you think that's really going to achieve what he wants with getting Beijing on side?
Part of what's happening is a matter of style. And the President of the United States has a style which he pursues in domestic matters inside the United States and in foreign affairs. It is not, in either context, necessarily traditional. All that is to say that this may have some positive impact on the situation, and the North may understand that there's a volatility they're not used to dealing with, and that may not be so bad. But this is not what I would call prudent. It isn't careful. And when we're dealing with war, and maybe a large war, and maybe even a nuclear exchange, I think to engage in language which raises tensions is not a careful and responsible way to proceed. But people of goodwill may differ over that.
OK, the question begs itself then, going back to the start, how do you get Pyongyang and a team of delegates round a negotiating table?
You put them in an airplane and you send them to the same place. And this is actually not rocket science. This is pretty clear. Neither side can put out preconditions and expect to get a meeting. Both sides have to agree to come to talks, perhaps talks about talks, without precondition. The United States is going to want something out of these negotiations. They're going to want an end to ballistic missile testing, nuclear weapons testing. They're going to want a bunch of things. The North is going to want some things. They don't like the exercises that the U.S. and Iraq do. They're going to want to dial those back. They want a normal relationship, end of hostile relations with the United States. All this is going to happen if it happens in the context of what I would guess will be protracted negotiations. Those in 1994 went on from the start in mid-1993 to almost the end of 1994. So one should not expect this will be quick or easy. How they start by both sides wanting them to start.
Well, people in Seoul are fairly sanguine. That's generally what we're gleaning from reports. What about you? Are you certain that we can't have an accidental war here?
I'm not so sure, by the way. I've been in Seoul for a week now, and I'm not so sure things are all that sanguine. I think that everybody from the president on down knows that there is always a potential in a situation like this that by miscalculation or some other means, we will end up in some sort of a military confrontation. And I am not at all sanguine. I think there's a lack of clarity over where various red lines may be, as to use that awful phrase again, what the United States will take as a provocation that would cause it to use force in response, whether the North Koreans will be restrained or not. This is a situation. Whenever I hear nobody wants war, that's what you hear immediately before wars, and so I'm concerned about this. I don't think all hope is lost.